5:30 in the morning. The coastline of eastern China. 134 Chinese fighter jets were already screaming off the runways of 10 different airbases. This was not a scheduled exercise. The pilots had been ordered into the sky without a single target or mission objective. The pre-dawn sky was a bruised purple. Low clouds hugged the coastline of Fujian province. The roar of afterburners shattered the morning silence. This was the largest scramble of the People's Liberation Army Air Force since 1958. Why now? Why this way? The question hung in the air like the scent of burnt kerosene. Inside the Integrated Command Center in Nanjing, the atmosphere was frozen. General Zhang stood before a wall of glass and digital displays. He did not speak. He did not need to. The command had been sent through a single encrypted data burst. Launch all available assets. Climb to 30,000 feet. Wait for further instructions. The pilots of the J-20 stealth fighters felt the weight of the moment. They were flying into the unknown. Their screens showed a massive swarm of friendly blue icons, but there were no red icons. There was no enemy. There was only the empty air and the ticking of the clock. They had received their orders via a red envelope protocol. This was reserved for national emergencies. Yet their heads-up displays remained empty of tactical data. No coordinates, no target profiles, just a bearing and an altitude. 600 miles away, the quiet was about to end. Inside the hardened concrete bunker of the American Air Operations Center at Kadena Air Base, the air was cool and smelled of ozone. Staff Sergeant Miller adjusted his headset. He looked at his radar scope. A single yellow dot appeared. Then 5, then 20. "Senior, I have an anomaly," Miller said. His voice was steady. The senior controller walked over. "Identify." "I cannot. They are popping up everywhere. Long Tian, Qian, Shan 2. It looks like a mass launch." The senior controller leaned in. "How many?" Miller paused. He counted the growing clusters. At least 60 in the first wave. More are coming off the deck now. "Sir, this is not a drill." Outside, the sun began to peak over the horizon. The light hit the wings of an American F-35 Lightning II on the tarmac. The pilot was already in the cockpit. He was waiting for the scramble order. It came 30 seconds later. The alarms at Kadena began to wail. It was a sound that had not been heard with this level of urgency in decades. The tension moved like a wave across the Pacific. From the cockpits of the Chinese J-16s to the Combat Information Center of the USS Howard, everyone saw the same thing. A wall of metal was rising from the mainland. It was moving toward the open ocean with no clear destination. In the history of modern warfare, a launch of this scale usually meant one thing: a preemptive strike. But the Chinese formation was not vectored toward any known military base. They were simply flying. General Zhang watched the icons spread across the map like a digital ink blot. He knew the Americans were watching. He knew their satellites were counting every tail number. That was the point. He looked at the timer on his secondary screen. 5 minutes since the first wheels left the ground. The world was now awake. The morning was still quiet. It would not stay that way. 5:46 in the morning. The Philippine Sea. The Combat Information Center of the USS Howard was bathed in the dim blue light of tactical consoles. It was quiet. Then the air changed. The electronic warfare officer adjusted his headset. His screen was no longer clear. A massive cluster of yellow icons began to bloom on the edge of the long-range radar. The officer spoke to the tactical action officer. "Sir, I have a massive radar bloom. Bearing 300, range 200 nautical miles." The tactical action officer leaned over the console. "Classify. Is it a weather anomaly?" "Negative. These are solid returns. I am counting 40, 50, 60. They are moving at 500 knots, level at 32,000 feet." The room grew cold. 60 aircraft did not just appear. 60 aircraft was a carrier air wing, but these were coming from the mainland. The tactical action officer keyed his internal comms. "Bridge. This is the Combat Information Center. We have a massive inbound aerial formation. High speed, large numbers. I am declaring a Tier 1 alert. 5:52 in the morning. 30,000 feet over the Taiwan Strait. Inside the cockpit of a Chinese J-16, the pilot felt the vibration of the twin engines through his seat. He looked to his left. A J-20 stealth fighter floated there. It was a dark shadow against the rising sun. He looked to his right. Another J-16. Beyond them were dozens more. They were flying in a tight, disciplined wall of metal. The pilot checked his data link. It was active, but silent. No targets were assigned. No mission parameters had been updated. He spoke into his mask. "Lead. This is Dragon 4-1. My tactical display is still empty. Confirm mission objective." The flight leader responded immediately. "Dragon 4-1. Maintain current bearing. Maintain silence. We are the objective." The pilot understood. They were not the hunters today. They were the bait. Or perhaps they were the message. 134 aircraft were now in the air. The sheer volume of electronic noise they generated was blinding. It was designed to overwhelm. It was designed to scream. 5:58 in the morning. The 7th Fleet headquarters in Yokosuka, Japan. The admiral stood in the center of the command floor. He watched the main screen. The yellow icons were now merging into a solid block of color. It looked like a tidal wave hitting a digital shore. The admiral turned to his chief of staff. "Where are our carriers?" The chief of staff pointed to 2 blue icons. The USS Ronald Reagan is 300 miles east of Luzon. The USS Nimitz is currently in the Philippine Sea. They are both launching cap flights now. But Admiral, we are outnumbered 5-1 in this sector. Do they have a target? The Admiral asked. No, sir. They are not vectored toward any island or any ship. They are simply flying a standard intercept track into international airspace, but they are doing it with everything they have. The Admiral looked at the clock. It had been 28 minutes since the first launch. In 20 more minutes, the Chinese formation would cross the median line. If they did not turn back, the rules of engagement would change. The world was watching a giant flex its muscles. The question was whether the giant intended to swing. The massive formation continued its steady drone toward the east. On every radar screen from Okinawa to Manila, the message was clear. The sky belonged to the one who filled it. The radar screens continued to glow. The distance between the two forces was closing. 6:05 in the morning. The skies over the first island chain. The regional response was instantaneous and massive. From the concrete hangars of Naha Air Base in Okinawa, Japanese F-15 Eagles roared into the damp morning air. Simultaneously, across the strait, Taiwanese F-16 Vipers took flight from Chiayi and Hualien. The quiet of the Pacific dawn was gone. It was replaced by the scream of high-performance engines and the invisible pulse of active radar. The Chinese formation was no longer a single mass. It had divided. 134 aircraft were now organized into 3 distinct waves. Each wave was miles wide. They moved with a mechanical precision that suggested a single mind was directing them. They were not maneuvering. They were not hiding. They were a wall of steel moving steadily toward the deep water. 6:12 in the morning. An E-3 Sentry airborne early warning aircraft. High above the Philippine Sea, the American E-3 Sentry circled at 35,000 feet. Inside the windowless cabin, 20 controllers stared at glowing screens. The senior controller wiped sweat from his upper lip. He had served 20 years. He had never seen a screen this crowded. The controller spoke to his team. "Track all leaders. I want tail numbers on every J-20 you can find." A technician responded. "Sir, they are running active jamming on the tactical frequencies. We are getting ghost returns. It looks like double the number of aircraft." "Filter the noise," the controller ordered. "Use the passive sensors. If they are pushing this much power, they are burning fuel. They cannot stay at this density forever." 6:18 in the morning. 32,000 feet over the East China Sea. A Taiwanese pilot looked out of his canopy. The sun was now fully above the horizon. It illuminated a sight that no training manual had prepared him for. To the west, the horizon was etched with white lines. Hundreds of contrails streaked across the blue. It looked like a giant claw reaching out from the mainland. The pilot keyed his radio. Taipei Control. This is Brave 1. I have visual. The sky is full of them. I am seeing J-16s and J-20s in a tiered formation. They are not responding to the guard frequency. Taipei Control replied. Brave 1. Maintain a distance of 10 nautical miles. Do not lock your radar. I repeat, do not lock your radar. We are in a gray zone situation. Do not give them a reason to fire. The Chinese pilots were equally tense. Inside a J-20, the lead pilot watched his electronic warfare display. It was a kaleidoscope of warning symbols. Japanese, American, and Taiwanese radars were all painting his skin. He felt the invisible energy of a dozen different nations trying to see through his stealth coating. His cockpit was a symphony of low-frequency hums and chirps. He checked his fuel state. He was at 60%. He looked at his watch. He had been in the air for 48 minutes. Still, no target had been assigned. The silence from his own command was the most stressful part of the flight. He was a professional. He was trained for combat. But he was not trained for this level of uncertainty. The two sides were now so close that the pilots could see the flashes of sunlight off the titanium of their rivals. Thousands of tons of high explosives and sophisticated sensors were hurtling toward each other at half the speed of sound. The margin for error had vanished. The radar screens across the Pacific were now a solid mass of overlapping icons. The world was holding its breath. One nervous finger or one computer glitch was all it would take. The distance continued to shrink. The first close-range encounters were seconds away. 6:25 in the morning. High above the East China Sea, the formation of J-20 stealth fighters began to separate from the main body of the Chinese force. They were no longer flying a flat, predictable course. They were climbing. Their powerful engines pushed them through the thin air at 48,000 feet. They were taking the high ground. In the world of aerial combat, altitude is energy. The Chinese pilots were positioning themselves to look down on everything else in the sky. The American pilots below saw the move instantly. Inside the cockpit of an F-35 Lightning II, the pilot known as Guardian 1 watched his glass display. The J-20s appeared as flickering icons at the top of his sensor range. They were perched above him like hawks waiting for a gap in the fence. Guardian 1 spoke into his radio. Control. This is Guardian 1. The J-20s are at Angels 48. They are over the top of us. Request permission to climb and intercept. The response from the E-3 Sentry was immediate and firm. Guardian 1. This is Control. Negative. Maintain 32,000 feet. Do not match their climb. Do not maneuver toward them. We are staying on our assigned track. Monitor only. Guardian 1 gripped the flight stick. His knuckles were white inside his flight gloves. Control. They have the tactical advantage. If they nose down, we are in a defensive hole. Copy. Guardian 1, the controller said. We are aware. The 7th Fleet Commander has issued a restricted status. You are not to engage. You are not to illuminate them with fire control radar. We do not want to trigger an automated response. 6:31 in the morning. The National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. The room was a hive of controlled activity. General Miller stood at the center of the room. He was looking at a satellite feed of the Chinese coastline. The heat signatures of 134 aircraft were still visible on the thermal sensors. What are the rules of engagement for the pilots? General Miller asked. A colonel stepped forward. Sir, the rules of engagement are at status yellow. Our pilots are ordered to remain professional. They are to fly parallel to the Chinese formation. No weapons are to be armed. We are treating this as a massive freedom of navigation exercise by the Chinese side. If one of our aircraft is fired upon, the local commander has the authority to respond. Until then, we are observing. General Miller shook his head. 134 sorties. This is not just an exercise. They are mapping our reaction times. They are seeing how many aircraft we can put in the air and how fast we do it. They are turning the entire Pacific into a laboratory. 6:37 in the morning. Inside the lead J-20 fighter, the Chinese flight leader was focused on his passive sensors. He did not need to use his radar. His aircraft was receiving data from the entire formation. He could see the American F-35 fighters clearly. He could see the Japanese F-15s and the Taiwanese F-16s. They were all there. They were all watching him. The flight leader spoke to his wingman over a secure, low probability of intercept link. Maintain your distance. They are staying low. They are showing restraint, the wingman responded. They are nervous. I can see their formations tightening. Should we begin the descent? Negative, the flight leader said. We stay at 48,000 feet. We show them that the high sky belongs to us. We wait for the next command from Nanjing. Do not arm your missiles. We are the wall. We are not the spear. Not yet. The two sides were now flying in a strange, silent dance. Hundreds of millions of dollars of technology were screaming through the air, yet no one spoke on the open frequencies. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the pilots and the constant electronic chirping of the threat receivers. The Chinese formation reached the edge of the International Air Defense Identification Zone. They were seconds away from crossing a line that had not been crossed in this strength in the modern era. The tension was no longer a feeling. It was a physical weight. 6:45 in the morning. The edge of the Philippine Sea. The distance between the leading Chinese J-20 and the American F-35 was now less than 5 nautical miles. It was no longer a radar contact. It was a visual reality. The American pilot. Guardian 1. He looked to his left and saw a dark, angular predator. It was a ghost in the morning light. The J-20 did not move. It was perfectly stable. It was part of a wall of metal that stretched for 50 miles across the horizon. Inside the American Combat Information Center, the tension was at a breaking point. The tactical action officer spoke to his team. Monitor their weapons bay doors. If they open, we engage. Copy. Monitoring, the sensor operator replied. No movement detected. They are flying clean. The silence on the radio was absolute. There were no insults. There were no warnings. There was only the sound of high-performance engines and the frantic chirping of radar warning receivers. This was the silent wall. 134 Chinese aircraft were now fully committed to a course that led directly into the heart of the American defensive screen. 6:51 in the morning. The Chinese formation was now deeper into international waters than any previous flight in history. They were burning thousands of pounds of fuel every minute. In the Nanjing Command Center, General Zhang watched the digital fuel gauges of his entire fleet. He knew the limit. He knew exactly how much time his pilots had before they reached the point of no return. A staff officer approached. General, the Americans have moved a second carrier strike group into a blocking position. They are launching their entire air wing. We are facing a wall of our own. General Zhang nodded slowly. Good. They are reacting exactly as the model predicted. They are showing us everything. Their launch sequences, their communication hubs, their tactical priorities. Let them scramble. We will hold the line for 4 more minutes. 6:55 in the morning. The two air forces were now merged into a single, massive, swirling mass of aircraft. It was a game of high-speed chicken at 30,000 feet. Neither side was willing to blink. The American F-35 pilots were flying on the ragged edge of their endurance. They were surrounded by superior numbers. Every time they looked at their displays, they saw 3 Chinese icons for every one of their own. Inside the cockpit of a J-16, the Chinese pilot felt the sweat beaded beneath his helmet. His hands were steady on the stick, but his heart was racing. He was flying less than 500 meters from an American fighter. He could see the pilot. He could see the markings on the American wings. This was the moment where training ended and instinct began. Maintain formation, the flight leader commanded. Do not break. Do not arm. We are the wall. The air was thick with electronic signals. Radars were screaming. Warning lights were flashing in every cockpit across the Pacific. The situation was no longer under the total control of the generals on the ground. It was in the hands of the individual pilots. One mistake, one accidental trigger pull. That was all it would take to turn this exercise into a global catastrophe. The two formations were now so dense that the wake turbulence from the lead jets was shaking the aircraft behind them. It was a physical, violent encounter. The peak was seconds away. The clock was ticking toward a collision that neither side could take back. 6:56 in the morning. The center of the swarm. The air was a chaotic mess of wake, turbulence, and electronic noise. 134 Chinese aircraft and 60 American and Japanese fighters were now occupying the same narrow corridor of sky. The physical buffeting was violent. Pilots fought their flight sticks to maintain position. It was a metal forest moving at 500 miles per hour. The wings of the jets were sometimes less than 30 meters apart. Inside the cockpit of a Chinese J-16, call sign Dragon 09. The pilot was struggling with a sensor malfunction. His primary display flickered under the weight of American jamming. He was blind for a split second. In the high-stress environment, his hand tightened on the flight stick. His thumb brushed the sensor slave switch. It was a mechanical error, a human reflex in a moment of extreme pressure. A narrow, high-energy radar beam shot out from the nose of the J-16. It was a hard lock. It was a fire control signal to every sensor in the sky. It looked like a direct declaration of intent to kill. 6:57 in the morning. Inside the American F-35, Guardian 1. A high-pitched, continuous wail filled the pilot's helmet. His tactical display turned blood red. A diamond symbol flashed over the Chinese jet to his left. The symbol was flashing. This meant a missile was ready to be guided to his cockpit. The automated voice of the aircraft spoke with terrifying calm. Warning. Radar lock. 10 o'clock high. Guardian 1 reacted on pure instinct. He flipped the master arm switch to arm. He did not think. He did not wait for orders. His finger hovered over the red missile release button. His breathing was heavy, ragged. He looked through his helmet visor at the J-16. He could see the missiles hanging from its wings. He spoke into the radio. Control, I am locked. Dragon 09 has a hard fire control lock on me. I am defensive. I am defensive. Permission to engage. 6:58 in the morning. The controller inside the E3 Sentry screamed into the headset. Guardian 1, hold fire. I repeat, hold fire. Break right. Deploy flares. Do not return the lock. Do not return the lock. Guardian 1 slammed the stick to the right. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision narrowed to a point. He punched the flare release. A string of magnesium candles ignited behind him. They burned at 2,000 degrees. They were designed to pull a missile away. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the impact. Inside the Chinese J-16, the pilot realized his error. He saw the American jet dive away. He saw the blinding white light of the flares. He looked at his screen. The lock was still active. He was frozen. His mind could not process the speed of the escalation. His flight leader's voice shattered his trance. Dragon 09. Break lock. Now. That is an order. Break lock or I will shoot you down myself. Break lock or I will shoot you down myself. 6:59 in the morning. The pilot of Dragon 09 snapped the switch to the off position. The radar beam vanished. But the damage was done. Across the Pacific, 200 missiles were now slave to their targets. 200 computer brains were waiting for the final command to launch. On the USS Howard, the sea-to-air missiles were already moving on their rails. In the Chinese hangars, the backup waves were spooling up their engines. The air was electric. The silence was dead. The screaming of the warning systems was the only sound left in the world. Thousands of men were waiting for one more mistake. The entire global order was balanced on the tip of a single finger. The American admiral in Japan held his breath. The Chinese general in Nanjing stood perfectly still. The world was 3 seconds away from a fire that could not be put out. 7 o'clock in the morning. The edge of the abyss. Every radio in every cockpit. Every speaker in every combat information center. Every civilian air traffic control tower from Tokyo to Manila. They all crackled to life at the exact same millisecond. It was not a jammer. It was a high-power broadcast using a frequency-hopping burst that covered every band from tactical to emergency guard. The voice that emerged was calm. It was slow. It was the voice of General Zhang. He spoke in precise English. This is the People's Liberation Army Air Force Command. The systemic integrity audit of the Pacific Theater is now complete. We have successfully measured the response times, the communication nodes, and the tactical priorities of all regional actors. We thank you for your participation in this assessment. All units, disengage. Return to base. The world stood still for 5 seconds. 7 o'clock and 30 seconds in the morning. Inside the cockpit of the American F-35, Guardian 1 stared at his glass display. The red diamond over the Chinese J-16 vanished. The radar lock was gone. The Chinese jet did not bank away in fear. It did not dive. It simply leveled off at exactly 32,000 feet. Its pilot looked toward Guardian 1. He raised a single hand in a professional salute. Then, he began a slow, disciplined turn back toward the mainland. The 100-mile wall of Chinese aircraft began to dissolve. It was not a retreat. It was a coordinated departure. The 134 aircraft divided back into their original flight groups. They moved with the same mechanical precision they had shown during the approach. They were no longer a threat. They were a data set. 7 o'clock and 1 minute in the morning. Inside the American E-3 Sentry, the controllers sat in stunned silence. The senior controller looked at the screen. The yellow tidal wave was receding. It was pulling back from the Philippine Sea like a ghost. The controller keyed his radio. All Guardian and Brave units. This is control. Do not pursue. I repeat, do not pursue. Maintain your current stations. They are RTB. They are returning to base. The tactical action officer on the USS Howard dropped into his chair. He was shaking. The adrenaline was leaving his system. He looked at the ship's clock. The entire event had lasted less than 90 minutes. In that time, the Chinese military had forced the United States and its allies to reveal every card in their hand. They had shown how fast they could scramble. They had shown which radar frequencies they used when they were scared. They had shown exactly which communication hubs were the most critical. By launching without a target, General Zhang had turned the entire Western defensive architecture into a laboratory. 7 o'clock and 3 minutes in the morning. The American admiral in Japan watched the screen. His face was grim. He understood the pivot. This was not a failed invasion. It was a successful harvest. China had just conducted the largest electronic intelligence gathering mission in human history, and they had done it by using the fear of the adversary as the primary sensor. The admiral turned to his chief of staff. They didn't want a war. They wanted the data on how we would fight one, and we gave it to them. Every bit of it. The sky was still full of aircraft, but the tension had changed. It was no longer the heat of combat. It was the cold realization of a strategic defeat. The Chinese formation was halfway back to the mainland before the first American politician had even been briefed. The morning sun was now high and bright. It reflected off the wings of the retreating jets. The silent wall was gone, but the silence that followed was far more unsettling. 7:05 in the morning, high above the Philippine Sea. The sky was no longer a crowded forest of metal. It was an expanding void. The Chinese formations were pulling away with a discipline that was almost eerie. They did not linger. They did not taunt. They simply turned as one and headed west. Inside the cockpit of Guardian 1, the American pilot watched his sensors. The high-pitched screaming of the radar warning receiver had finally stopped. The silence in his helmet was deafening. He adjusted his oxygen mask and took a long, shaking breath. He keyed his radio. Control, Guardian 1. The bandits' correction, the Chinese flights, are at range 15 nautical miles and extending. They are maintaining military power, no aggressive maneuvering detected. Copy. Guardian 1, the controller replied. Break off your intercept. Return to your cap station. The 7th Fleet Commander has declared a stand down. Guardian 1 looked over his shoulder. He could still see the sun reflecting off the tail fins of the retreating J-20s. He felt a strange, hollow sensation in his chest. He had been seconds away from pulling the trigger. He had been ready to start a war. Now, he was being told to go back to a routine patrol as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. 7:12 in the morning. The Combat Information Center of the USS Howard. The blue-lit room was filled with the sound of rapid typing and low murmurs. The tactical action officer stood in front of the primary display. The massive cloud of yellow icons was now a series of neat, outbound tracks. The electronic warfare officer looked up from his console. His face was pale. "Sir, I have been running a diagnostic on our signal logs. During the 90 minutes of the encounter, the Chinese formation was not just flying, they were pulsing the entire spectrum. Every time we adjusted our radar frequencies to get a better look, they recorded it. Every time we used a secure data link to coordinate with the Japanese or the Taiwanese, they mapped the handshake." The tactical action officer narrowed his eyes. "You are saying they baited us into showing our electronic signature? More than that." "Sir," the officer said, "they forced us to activate our high-intensity combat modes. Systems we usually keep in reserve for actual war. They have a complete recording of our defensive pulse. They know our blind spots. They know how we scream when we are startled." The realization settled over the room like a physical weight. The 134 aircraft were not a strike package. They were a giant flying sensor array. By doing nothing, they had forced the United States to reveal everything. 7:18 in the morning. The National Military Command Center at the Pentagon. General Miller stared at a printed report. It was a preliminary assessment from the National Security Agency. The report was only 3 paragraphs long. It stated that the Chinese Silent Command had likely captured more high-fidelity electronic intelligence in 90 minutes than their satellite network had gathered in 10 years. "They played us," Miller whispered. A colonel stood nearby. "Sir, we had to react. We could not assume it was a test. If they had been carrying live ordnance for a strike and we had stayed on the ground, we would have lost the fleet." "I know," Miller said. "That is the trap. They created a situation where our only responsible choice was to give them exactly what they wanted. They didn't need to fire a single missile to win this round. They just needed us to turn on our lights." Far to the west, the Chinese aircraft began to cross the coastline. They were returning to their hangars. Their mission was a total success. They were bringing back the digital fingerprints of an entire regional defense system. The tension was fading, but the confusion was just beginning. The analysts were now the ones on the front line. 7:25 in the morning. The East China Sea. The massive cloud of radar returns was now a series of thinning lines. The Japanese 15 Eagles were the first to peel away. They banked hard toward Okinawa. Their fuel lights were blinking amber. They had spent their energy and their nerves on a ghost hunt. The Taiwanese F-16s followed shortly after. They dipped their wings in a silent acknowledgement to the American controllers. The sky was returning to its natural state. Empty, blue, and indifferent. Inside the cockpit of a Japanese 15. The pilot looked at his fuel gauge. He had less than 10 minutes of loiter time remaining. He looked back at the western horizon. The white streaks of the Chinese contrails were fading into the haze. The pilot keyed his radio. "Naha Control. This is Eagle Lead. We are Bingo Fuel. Returning to base. The sky is clear, but it does not feel empty. Copy. Eagle Lead," the controller replied. "Safe flight home. The tracking station reports all Chinese assets have crossed the 12-mile limit. The party is over." 7:35 in the morning. Airbases across the Fujian and Guangdong provinces. The landing sequences were conducted with the same eerie silence that had defined the launch. One after another, the J-20s and J-16s touched down on the sun-baked concrete. There were no victory rolls. There were no cheers from the ground crews. This was a clinical operation. As each canopy opened, a technician ran to the side of the aircraft. They did not check the weapons pylons. They did not look for battle damage. They reached for a small, hardened data port beneath the cockpit. They pulled the solid-state memory drives. These small, black rectangles contain the heartbeat of the Western Pacific Defense Network. Inside the Nanjing Command Center, General Zhang watched the status board turn green as each tail number checked in. He looked at the senior intelligence officer. "Begin the decryption immediately. I want the reaction patterns mapped against the automated response algorithms of the 7th Fleet." The officer nodded. "We already have the preliminary feed. General, we didn't just capture their radar frequencies. We captured their decision logic. We know exactly when their AI takes over from the human operators. 7:45 in the morning. The Pentagon. The mystery was no longer about why the Chinese had launched. It was about what they had actually taken. A team of analysts from the Defense Intelligence Agency sat around a conference table. They were looking at a playback of the encounter. One analyst pointed to the screen. "Look at the timing here. Every time our Combat Information Center shifted its defensive posture, the Chinese formation adjusted within 3 seconds. That is faster than human communication allows. They weren't just reacting to us. They were plugged into our network. They were using our own sensor data to refine their flight paths." A senior colonel leaned forward. "Are you saying they used our own systems against us?" "Yes, sir," the analyst said. "This wasn't a show of force. It was a digital autopsy. They opened us up. They looked at how our nerves are wired, and then they stitched us back up before we even knew we were on the table. They now have a map of our collective military brain." The room went quiet. The realization was more terrifying than a physical attack. A missile can be shot down. A stolen secret. A mapped mind. That was a permanent disadvantage. The Silent Command had achieved a victory that would not appear in any news headline. The crisis was over. The American leadership was beginning to understand that the 134 aircraft were just the delivery vehicle. The real weapon was the data they were now unloading in Nanjing. The morning was bright and clear, but for the men in the room, the world had just become a very dark place. 8 o'clock in the morning, the South China Sea and the East China Sea. The sky was finally empty. The last of the 134 Chinese aircraft had touched down on the mainland. The roar of afterburners had been replaced by the cooling whistle of turbine blades. There was no celebration in the Chinese hangars. The pilots climbed out of their cockpits with stiff limbs and salt-stained flight suits. They handed over their data drives to waiting technicians and walked toward the debriefing rooms. They had flown a mission that had no target, yet they felt the exhaustion of a long-distance combat sortie. 8:15 in the morning. On the flight deck of the United States ship Ronald Reagan, the recovery of the American air wing was underway. The screech of tires on the steel deck and the slam of the arresting wires were the only sounds. The yellow-shirted deck crew moved with practiced efficiency. They were exhausted. They had worked in a high-intensity environment for over 2 hours. They did not talk about the near miss. They did not talk about the radar lock. They focused on the tailhooks and the chocks. Inside the pilot-ready room, Guardian 1 sat on a vinyl chair. He still had the imprint of his oxygen mask on his face. He stared at a cup of cold coffee. A fellow pilot sat down next to him. "You okay?" the pilot asked. Guardian 1 nodded slowly. "I was on the trigger. I had the tone. I was ready to end it." "We all were," the other pilot said. They knew exactly how far to push. They stopped 1 inch before the line. "That is the problem," Guardian 1 said. "They know where the line is now. They measured it with a ruler." 8:30 in the morning. The 7th Fleet headquarters in Yokosuka. The admiral stood by the window. He watched the harbor. The morning was beautiful. The water was a calm, deep blue. It looked nothing like the electronic battlefield he had been staring at for the last 90 minutes. The crisis had resolved without a single casualty. On paper, it was a victory for de-escalation, but the admiral felt no relief. The red phone on his desk rang. It was the secure line to the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. "Admiral, this is Admiral Davidson," the voice on the other end said. "Give me the short version. Did we lose anything?" "No ships, no planes, no men," the admiral replied. "But we lost the element of surprise. We lost our electronic invisibility. They forced us to show them how we react to a mass saturation attack. They have the tape, they have the data, and they have the initiative." "Copy," Davidson said. "The Pentagon is already convening a task force. We are going to have to rewrite every engagement protocol in the theater." This was a masterclass in gray zone warfare. The conversation was short, professional. There was no room for ego or anger. The crisis had fully resolved. The two giants had stepped back from the edge, but the ground they stood on was no longer the same. The Pacific was a different ocean than it had been at 5 in the morning. The silence had returned. But it was the silence of a library where one side was now studying the other side's most guarded secrets. The ships continued their patrols. The sun continued to rise. 11:15 in the morning, Washington, District of Columbia. The sun was high over the Potomac River. Inside the windowless vaults of the National Security Agency, the work was only beginning. Thousands of miles away from the quiet of the Philippine Sea, the electronic ghosts of the morning encounter were being resurrected on high-resolution displays. The lead analyst adjusted his glasses. He pointed to a scrolling line of green code. Here, this is the moment Guardian 1 armed his master switch. Look at the Chinese response. A second analyst leaned in. They didn't just see the radar lock. They saw the encrypted handshake between the F-35 and the E-3 Sentry. They recorded the exact frequency hop of our BattleNet. It is worse than that, the lead analyst said. They weren't just listening. They were prodding. Every time they changed their formation, they were looking for the delay in our command chain. They now know exactly how many seconds it takes for an order to move. From Hawaii to a cockpit in the East China Sea, they have mapped our latency. 12:30 in the afternoon, Beijing. Inside a secure briefing room of the Central Military Commission, General Zhang stood before a small group of senior officials. He was not wearing his medals. He looked tired, but his eyes were sharp. The systemic integrity audit was a complete success, Zhang said. His voice was a low murmur. We now possess the electronic signature of every major American and Japanese surface-to-air radar. In the first island chain, we have identified 16 critical vulnerabilities in their automated handoff protocols. One of the officials looked up, and the risk of escalation. The risk was managed, Zhang replied. Our pilots performed with absolute discipline. We proved that we can paralyze their decision-making process simply by filling the sky with noise. They are reactive. We are proactive. That is the only metric that matters in the next decade. 1:45 in the afternoon. The Philippine Sea. The USS Howard moved slowly through the water. The flight deck was quiet. The sailors who had been at their stations for 12 hours were finally eating. But the mood in the mess decks was not celebratory. There was a sense of being watched, a feeling that the ocean was no longer as wide as it used to be. The electronic warfare officer stood on the bridge wing. He looked out at the horizon. He knew that somewhere under the waves, or high in the atmosphere, the data they had leaked was being analyzed. He felt like a man who had just realized his house was being scouted by a professional thief. The thief had not taken anything yet, but he knew where the spare key was hidden. He knew which windows were unlocked, and he knew exactly how long it would take for the police to arrive. 5 hours later, the Pacific Command in Hawaii. The tactical maps were still active, but the icons were sparse now. The massive yellow cloud was a memory. The military analysts were already calling it the 90-minute war of data. No blood had been spilled, no metal had been twisted, but the strategic foundation of the Pacific had been cracked. The political fallout was just beginning to gather speed. In Tokyo, Manila, and Taipei, the governments were asking the same question. If China can do this on a Wednesday morning without warning, what can they do when they actually intend to strike? The aftermath was not about rebuilding. It was about relearning. Every manual, every code, every tactic was now under review. The silent command had changed the rules of the game, and the game was far from over. The sun began to set over the western horizon. The sky turned a deep, blood red. It was a beautiful sight, but for those who understood the data, it was the color of a warning light. 3 days later, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. The conference room was filled with the soft hum of high-end ventilation. On the table were 3 thick, bound reports. They were marked with red stripes. Top secret, single copy only. The men and women around the table were the architects of Pacific strategy. They were not looking at maps of islands or carrier strike groups. They were looking at graphs of signal interference and decision tree logic. The lead strategist stood up. He did not use a pointer. He simply looked at his colleagues. What happened 72 hours ago was not a military exercise. It was a funeral for the way we thought about modern conflict. We have spent 50 years preparing for a war of attrition, a war of missiles and kinetic energy. But the Chinese command just proved that the most effective weapon is not a warhead. It is a question. He paused. He looked at the window. The city of Washington was moving as it always did. They asked us a single question. How do you breathe when you are afraid? And we showed them. We showed them every lung, every nerve, every reflexive muscle. We didn't lose a ship, but we lost the invisible armor of our tactical unpredictability. 1,600 miles west of Hawaii, the Pacific Ocean. The ocean was a deep, endless blue. A single American destroyer moved through the swells. From the deck, the horizon looked empty, but the sailors on watch knew better. They knew the sky was now a library, and their signatures were the books. Inside the Combat Information Center, the screens were back to their routine displays. The yellow swarm was gone, but the operators no longer trusted the empty space. They looked at the green dots with a new kind of suspicion. They understood that the silence of the adversary was not a lack of action. It was a form of observation. The strategist in Washington continued. Modern warfare is no longer decided by who fires first. It is decided by who understands the other side's reaction better, by launching 134 aircraft without a target. General Zhang forced us to create our own target. He turned our fear into his data. We are now living in the era of the transparent battlefield. There are no more secrets in the battlefield. Electromagnetic spectrum. Only different levels of awareness. The report on the table was titled The Silent Command. It would become the most studied document in the history of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It detailed the new reality of the Pacific, a reality where a mass launch is a survey, and a radar lock is a handshake. 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the coastline of China. General Zhang walked along the pier of a small fishing village near Fuzhou. He was dressed in civilian clothes. He watched the wooden boats return with their catch. The air smelled of salt and drying nets. It was a timeless scene. He thought about the 90 minutes. He thought about the pilots who had flown into the wall of American steel. They had done something more difficult than fighting. They had restrained themselves in the face of absolute tension. They had been the eyes and ears of a nation. He looked out toward the horizon. He knew the Americans were rewriting their manuals. He knew their satellites were repositioning. He knew the bat game had merely reset to a higher level of complexity. The ocean is wide, Zhang whispered to himself. But the mind must be wider. The sun dipped below the horizon. The light faded from the sky. The Pacific was dark. But it was not quiet. Beneath the surface and high in the thin air, the invisible pulses of two great powers continued to beat. They were watching, they were listening, they were waiting. The next time the command was sent, it might not be silent. But for now, both sides had learned what they needed to know. The world remained at peace. Not because the weapons were gone, but because the leaders finally understood exactly what those weapons would do. The morning of the 134 sorties was over. The lesson would last forever.